Hey, Angela, thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have you.
Kunjan, I'm so excited for this conversation.
Why don't we just start with some intros? I think most people know who you are, but can you just tell us a little bit about you? And maybe because we're talking about cell phones, you can tell us when you got your first cell phone.
Like a personal cell phone history introduction, I would love to do that. I am Angela Duckworth. I am 55 years old. So when I was growing up and also when I was a teacher, which is one of the first things I did professionally, there were no cell phones and I didn't really have to think about it. I became a teacher because I really like kids and I found myself spending a lot of time tutoring and being a big sister and volunteering in schools when I was in college studying neurobiology. And so instead of going to medical school, like my dad wanted me to, I went into education. And now, if you fast forward, I would describe myself as a psychologist, a researcher, a professor. And my most recent and maybe most ambitious project in my career has been to work on school cell phone policies.
Why you're choosing school cell phones to research?
You know, the origin story of this project, which we call Phones in Focus, is is that there was a day in August, over a year ago, so August 2024, when I realized that I could not understand what the research was saying about mental health and teenagers and just, what was the bottom line, what's causing what and how much should we worry about phones and so forth. And at the same time, I was asking my collaborators, well, now collaborators, but just at the time, these economists that I really respected and admired because they had worked on cell phones. And I'm talking about Matt Jensko and Hunt Alcott at Stanford. And the three of us got together and we said, one of the most important areas that has not been studied at all is schools and cell phones. So much has been on like parents and social media. But what about just the policy a school has about when you can use your phone and where you're allowed to keep it? So I decided to work with them on it. And I will tell you personally, Kunjin, that my daughters are now 24 and 22. I gave them cell phones when they were in fifth and sixth grade, which is in retrospect too early. And they kind of ordered me to do this study. I was like, your mom's really busy. Like I already had things that I was supposed to do in the last year or so, and I cleared my plate because I had to agree with them that, kids and phones and screens and schools. I mean, this is some of the most important um, work that I could do. That's why I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you.
Um, That's so awesome. I love that your kids were like, hold up, mom, stop whatever you're doing. We have a new plan for you. You've been on a relentless pursuit to get 100,000 educators to take your Phones in Focus survey, and you released some preliminary results in October. I know you have a lot more work to do, but what are you learning?
This Phone and Focus survey is a 5-minute survey for only for teachers in K-12 public schools. And we have over 40,000 responses, so not quite 100,000, but not bad. These are teachers from all 50 states, and they are from elementary, middle, and high school. And we now have a pretty clear sense, first of all, of what policies look like in the United States. And that is, by the way, unprecedented. Like if you asked a journalist or even a high level official, like, so what is the United States doing on phones? Nobody could tell you. And now we can say, look, we can say at a state by state level, a district by district level, and a school by school level, there's great variety, but there are only three kinds of policies when it comes to when students are allowed to use their phones. There are many schools in this country that only have a sort of a scheduled restriction policy, which is like you can use it between classes and lunch typically, or recess during certain non-academic periods. There's another policy that's stricter, and that is bell to bell. So from the first bell of school to the last bell of school. Lastly, there's just not having any policy at all. So those are three varieties. We see it in every state. I mean, even the states, honestly, that have bell to bell laws, like there are schools that are reporting that that is actually not their school's policy. But by and large, that does track with state legislation. But there's another dimension of school policies for cell phones that I think doesn't get enough attention and is really important. And to me, as a psychologist who has been studying goals and grit and self control for 20 plus years, I think it really needs more discussion, and that is where schools allow students to keep their phones, not when they're allowing students to use them, but where they're allowed to keep them. And I say that because as a psychologist, I know that physical distance creates psychological distance from temptation. So if you're trying not to eat dessert, we all know, like, push the dessert away, ask the waiter not to give you the dessert menu. What we're seeing in schools is there are actually more ways to handle the where question. So the strictest and the most rare is that there are some schools in this country that do not allow students to bring their phones at all. That is not only rare, but getting more rare. The second most strict is what we call centralized collection. That is, like, you have to turn your phone in at the very beginning of the school day, typically in the main office, and then you get it back from the main office. So it's really separated from you because your principal is holding it. Sometimes this is with, homeroom teachers, if that school has homeroom at the beginning and the end of the day. Then it kind of goes up from there. One of the policies that has emerged as being very effective is forcing kids to keep their phones in their hallway locker, which does allow them to access it, but it's like 2 floors away. It's under, it's behind lock, right? So you have to, like, unlock your locker. You're also not at your locker all day. Yonder pouches is another very popular approach. And those, I would just say, the ones that I just mentioned there all create physical distance and friction. And all of those policies perform quite well in our research in terms of how teachers feel about the policy in terms of their satisfaction, but also the percentage of students who are on task in class compared to off task because they're on their phone. But the more relaxed policies don't perform very well. And that includes teachers collecting the phones at the beginning and end of every class, because then the phones are still in a cubby in the room. And by the way, teachers are also telling us they don't like doing that. Like, they already have a lesson plan. They don't want to spend 5 minutes collecting everybody's phones and 5 minutes distributing them at the end of the class. It also performs much better than the most popular policy in the United States, which is no-show. The no-show policy is like, don't ask, don't tell. Like you can keep your phone anywhere. I just don't want to see it. And that is about half of schools in the country. And that does not perform very well, in part because when you say that to a student, where they keep the phone is, like, usually in their back pocket or their backpack, and that's very close to them. So we'll just say that, the emerging insights are that teachers want stricter policies, and that it matters where a school allows students to keep their phones as well as when they are allowed to use them.
That's so interesting. I mean, it makes sense because, I am tempted to eat chocolate all the time, but it's better when the chocolate is locked up in a cabinet in a different room.
I
And
mean, how many people are like, I'm not going to buy Halloween candy until October 30th because I don't want Snickers bars, like, in my
exactly.
pantry at 3 in the afternoon and so it's kind of common sense. And that is why, when we developed our survey, we did it with teachers. So this was not kind of like, pointy-headed academics foisting a survey, onto teachers with being, tone deaf. Like, actually, the survey went through many iterations, and teachers were able to tell us, like, what policies there were and also the kinds of questions they wanted. And I think they were asking for this kind of question. They also asked us to include a question on implementation, which I know, Kunjan, as somebody who's been, like, central to this project as a consultant, you were also, very quick to say, like, policies are one thing and how they're implemented is another. And I can tell you that we added a question on implementation. And from that data, we can tell you that the stricter policies are being implemented with greater fidelity. In other words, when you ask teachers what percentage of adults in the school are actually enforcing this policy, the stricter the policy, the greater the enforcement.
Well, and the stricter the policy, the more collective the action is. In other words, if you just leave it to teachers to have to be the enforcer, it makes it really, really hard to create consistency. But when you help the
Yeah.
teacher enforce, then you are creating a shared expectation.
I think one of the realizations we have to make as a society about phones and about screens and about ultra processed food and, other things that we feel like are not good for us in the long run is that it's not just an individual problem, it's a collective problem. And it's almost impossible for an individual to use willpower alone to eat the right way, to be civil and polite, to, stay off your screen. And so when schools, think about a policy like school cell phone policy, policies in particular, I think they want to think of the collective action. And a lot of the teachers in our survey, there's this, one question, which is basically like, is there anything else you would like to tell us? And teachers are saying that, they don't like being the bad cop, right? They don't like it when, they have a strict policy in their classroom and their students walk down the hallway and go to, Miss Kunjan's class. And like in that class, we're allowed to do whatever we want. And again, I think you're exactly right that the collective aspect of this is the way to go. One of my, favorite schools in this research has been the Schuyler Colfax Middle School. They emerged early on as a positive outlier, meaning their teachers said, we're very satisfied with this policy. There were very few kids who were distracted. We looked up the particulars and we found it was a lockers only bell to bell school. And it was within commuting distance of where I live, which is Philadelphia. So I took the train. I went to go visit, and this collective nature, this kind of, this is not a punitive policy. This is just a collective intentional decision on the part of the school community, including its parents, to say that we as a group want to take a stand on where students, are able to keep these temptations during the 6 or 7 hours of the day where they are under the roof of their school. And it's, really fun to see the posters on the wall and the climate, because we spent some time there, my team and I. And, if you even ask the students, like, what do you think? They're like, it's great. I asked the librarian, she said, twice as many books are being checked out of the library since we've had this policy. So I feel like it's a rare win-win policy for schools. I don't see many downsides to having intentional collective action.
One downside that I sometimes hear is from parents who are worried about student safety or their students' ability to connect with them. And I'm curious just how you would advise policymakers to think about that.
Heather Weinstein, who's the principal of that school, gave a lot of thought about that. She said, before we have this policy in place, we need to, in word and deed, make parents feel safe about, how their kids are, going to be, contacted or communicated with in the event, God forbid, of real emergency like a school shooting. And then there are also the mundane kind of like your dentist appointment is at 3:30 and not at 3:15, and so like your dad will be picking you up. I mean, that kind of communication, which every every parent recognizes is also just part of life. And so there was a lot of thought to that. And if you are a parent of that middle school, and this is true of other schools in our sample, you can call the main office. There are these mechanisms in place where if you need to know about the state of the school in case of emergency, there are other, communication channels. I mean, calling the main office, I sound like a real old person. I'm not quite a boomer, but I guess I am Gen X. And it is actually how my parents got in touch with my school. I will say that we've spoken a lot to, safety officers, not only the large district level like Chicago, but also in states, right? So, states that actually have a dedicated leader who thinks about school safety statewide. And I will tell you that what we're hearing across the board is that it's not great if 72 kids call 911 in the event of an emergency. In fact, it's the opposite of great. So I know that these have nuances, and like you said, many parents will consider this a trade-off. But I do think that the idea that direct parent to student conversation in the event of an emergency, that's not what the experts are saying is the best in that situation anyway. So again, I think there are enough now positive examples in the United States to show that we don't need to rely on individual student cell phones to accommodate those very real parent concerns.
One last question for me. What should we expect next? You're doing this massive survey. There's more research that you'll publish. But what other questions are you curious about as it relates to cell phones and cell phone use in schools?
Well, I will say to begin, Kunjan, you won't be surprised that we are hoping to get every school in the country represented. It would not be a survey, it would be a census. And I do think the issue of school cell phones is important enough to say, could we expect 5 minutes from, an educator in every school in the country to contribute? Yeah, absolutely. Because we want to know what's happening in your classroom, under your roof, how you think it's going, and, your reflection on how that, it could go, right? So, tell us what you think if you're listening and you're an educator. When we do have all the data, we are going to link to objective outcomes. We have amazing partnerships with now, thanks to Watershed and to other advocates of the project. 35 out of 50 states have formal relationships. This is an initiative of the National Governors Association. And because of these partnerships, we're going to be linking to attendance, standardized achievement test scores, and then whatever kind of climate and behavioral data are available at the state level. And our expectation is that, we will find consistent results with what we're seeing in the teacher surveys, which is that we're expecting that, stricter policies will yield more positive student outcomes. So that's all to come. And then finally, I'll just say that for, these states and districts, one of the things that we've been thinking about as a team is, what can we give that's of direct benefit? And so we are going to be providing personalized reports at the district and school level, assuming that they have enough data, so they can have a really fine-grained analysis of how those educators feel and what recommendations those educators have. And then the last thing is that, we are going to be identifying positive outliers in every state in our partnership. And I have heard from, the state chiefs that are like, it's really nice to applaud, the leaders who have really been on the leading edge. And so they're looking forward to the list of those names.
That's amazing. It's been a real honor to partner with you, Angela, through this. Thank you for including us in the conversation. Thank you for your friendship, and thank you for the spices that you sent me the other day. I'm so excited
Yeah,
to see them.
I hope you enjoy them.
I will really, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much, Angela. Great to have
Awesome,
you.
awesome. Okay, talk soon.